Hello and welcome back to Project 380. In this video I'm going to be installing some modifications to the power steering system. I know what you're all thinking. Power steering on a turbo MX5 is pretty brave, but I like a challenge. Most of the time when you see people turbo their MX5s, they ditch the power steering completely. Remove the pump, the lines, block off that steering rack and convert it to manual steering. Some may argue you get a better feel without power steering when you're drifting and you get a better track feel, but I wanted to do everything I can to keep power steering in a turbo MX5. It's been a bit challenging, but I think I've worked it out. Keeping power steering when you have a turbo setup comes with a few challenges. If you have a low mounted turbo down here, the power steering pump is in the way of the air intake into the turbo. And if you have a top mounted turbo setup like mine, the low pressure pipe into the pump, because it points backwards, hits the intercooler pipe. This is the intake to the power steering pump. This usually mounts there, and as you can see, it's hitting the intercooler pipe, so that's completely useless now. This is a Mark II car with a Mark II power steering pump, and the next issue is the high pressure side. That sits on the pump, something like that, and goes straight down, and on my setup with the custom intercooler piping, there's just not enough flex in the high pressure pipe to go either side of the intercooler piping. Another issue with a top mounted turbo like mine is the intake to the turbo. If I want to mount a nice big air filter onto this turbo, power steering reservoir is right in the way. And if you're running an intercooler, you need to move the power steering cooler. But before I solve any of those issues, I want to rectify a problem with the power steering pump itself first. And that common issue is this tensioning bolt bending and breaking. This bolt is exposed and over time it will seize. You'll go to put a little bit of tension on the belt and end up bending or snapping this bolt. To stop this issue ever happening again, I'm actually going to replace the whole tensioning system for the power steering pump. And I'm going to replace that with a rear axle divergence tensioning system. This directly replaces the old tensioning system. I purchased this from Boffy Racing. I'll leave a link in the description down below. To change the tensioning system over, I'm actually going to take the pump off of the car. You don't necessarily need to do this, but to make it easier to show you guys how this works, I'm going to take the pump off. If you were going to do this on the car, slightly loosen this bolt and this bolt here, spin the crank until this access window allows you access to the main bolt through the power steering pump. Slightly loosen that, detension the belt using this bolt and take the belt off. Then you can spin this pulley to gain access to the two bolts in here, holding the big main bracket onto the steering pump. With the power steering pump off the car now, you can see that if you turn the access windows, you can gain access to the two bolts holding the tensioning mechanism on. Just undo them with a 14mm socket and ratchet, and the whole mechanism can come off. A quick look side by side, the old tensioning system against the rear axle divergence system. So the old system used a plate with a slotted hole to slide along and a long M8 bolt to tension it. This was the main problem right here. The rear axle divergence system has done away with all of that. A nice strong stainless steel bracket with a rose jointed tensioner. This can take a lot more tension, it's easily adjustable, and fingers crossed, should never bend or break. This could go on a Mark I or a Mark II. The only difference being is there's no bracket here for the high pressure line. And they've done this for one good reason. The bracket for the Mark II looks like this, but the Mark I sits lower and at a different angle. This fits onto the power steering pump exactly the same as the old one came off. I would advise you to put some blue Loctite on the two bolts, but I'm not going to right now. You'll see why in a little bit. Now that's ready to go back on the car. While I've got the pump off the car, I'm also going to take a 27mm spanner and loosen off the high pressure union. You'll see why I've done this in a little while. Back on the car now, just with that lower bolt installed. This setup is a lot simpler. Just one bolt into the end of the rose joint and into the threaded hole of the power steering mounting bracket. It's probably a good idea to put a bit of blue Loctite on that bolt and then tighten that bolt down. Not only is this tensioning system a lot stronger, but it's actually easier to tension. Instead of undoing multiple bolts on the old system, this one you just have to undo this bottom bolt slightly, undo the two lock nuts on the rose joint, and spin the adjuster until the desired tension on the belt is reached, and then lock that tensioner off with the locking nuts. Now on to fixing the first issue of keeping power steering when you turbo your MX5. The low pressure line straight into the pump. This old fitting just isn't going to work anymore. It simply won't fit with the intercooler piping. So I've taken an old fitting, cut this end off and cut it off flush here with the mounting plate, welded it all together at a different angle, so now it looks a little something like this. Make sure you put a nice new O-ring on this before installing it. I haven't just yet, as I still want to get this painted, and that's going to sit something like that. But this has now created another issue. Trying to get a bit of hose to fit from there to the power steering reservoir is going to be a little bit difficult. The bend is going to be really sharp, and we have to allow for the power steering pump to move backwards and forwards while tensioning the belt. But luckily the power steering reservoir was an issue for me. I want to make space here for a nice air filter or dose pipe for the turbo, which means I wanted to relocate this anyway. But because of the mounting holes and the fact that both pipes are bent downwards to clear the chassis rail, I can't simply relocate this further back, as then the pipes are facing straight towards the chassis rail. So I've got to come up with a better solution than this. To solve this issue, I've bought a Mishimoto power steering reservoir, which has an in and an out, a nice polished cap, and a mounting bracket, and it's finished off in wrinkled black, which will go nicely with the day fab equipment I've already got installed. A bit of a side note if Mishimoto are listening, I think this is a really good product, but I think it can be slightly better. The mounting bracket only fixes in one location. This would be a lot better if it was a complete ring design with multiple bolt holes, so you could turn this around and put this bracket wherever you needed it. Apart from that, it's a great product. I've made my own stainless steel mounting bracket to attach to the Mishimoto bracket, which will allow me to place this in the engine bay. Now installing this gives me one more problem, and that is down here. This input and this output are the same size, and if we compare it to the old one, the in and the out are two different sizes. That's 10mm and that's 8mm. But luckily these fittings on the Mishimoto tank are removable, so I can remove this one and replace it with an 8mm barb fitting. Now I had a lot of difficulty finding this fitting because the thread on the end here is M12 by 1, and that's a bit of a strange fitting. Standard M12 is M12 by 1.5, and then you get a fine fitting which is M12 by 1.25. So M12 by 1 is really fine, but I did manage to find this off eBay after a little bit of digging. But that could be installed straight into the reservoir and installed on the car. I wanted to change the location of the power steering reservoir from here and tuck it nicely back here. Nice, neat and out of the way. This Mishimoto power steering reservoir is the perfect height for this little place down here. It doesn't stick up too high, so you know the bonnet's going to close, and it sits really nicely in this gap here. I've just put a little nutsert down in there to hold my custom bracket to hold the reservoir in place. And now, as you can see, the 10mm line going from the reservoir to the pump has a nice smooth bend in it, and I'm going to have plenty of pipe, so when I adjust the pump, pipe isn't going to pull tight or bunch up and kink. That is fitting really nice now. I've added a bit of pipe that is rated for power steering fluid, attached it to the pump and the reservoir, and secured it down here with a P-clip. It's secured here, so when you're tensioning the power steering pump or the engine is rocking about, it's not going to put too much pressure on the power steering reservoir. So it's all secure here, and I've got a nice length of pipe to allow for movement. And that brings me on to the second issue of keeping power steering when you're turboing your MX5, the high pressure line. That really isn't going to fit now, but I've come up with a solution. I'm going to use a hose from a Mark 1 power steering system, which fits onto the pump this way, round the front of the pump rather than down the side. This pipe is going to keep nicely away from my intercooler pipe, feeding it down the front in between the engine and the anti-roll bar. But this brings us to another issue. The fitment for the Mark 1 power steering pump is not the same as the fitting for the Mark 2 pump. Luckily, I think there's a fix for this, and that's why earlier I took a spanner to the high pressure fitting so I could remove that and change it from the Mark 2 high pressure fitting to a Mark 1 high pressure fitting. It seems that where it goes in the pump is completely identical, but on the top is just a different fitting, so hopefully this should work really well. But please let me know in the comments down below if there are any differences apart from the tops, with some nice new O-rings that could go back into the pump. Having this nice new tensioning bracket creates another problem. There is no bracket sitting right here to either hold the Mark 2 or the Mark 1 pipe in place, and there is a reason for this. This tensioning bracket fits a Mark 1 and a Mark 2 steering pump, and the brackets here are slightly different between each pump. You don't necessarily need to use this to hold the pipe in place, but I know my power steering is going to get abused, and the last thing I want is for this pipe to work itself loose. So I've cut up an old Mark 1 bracket, moved the top support bracket and welded it back together. So now I'm going to bolt this on top of this new tensioning bracket. There's plenty of space here between the bracket and the pulley, so I shouldn't have any worries with interference. And it will sit something like that, holding the high pressure line nice and firm, and plenty of space for the belt and pulley. But this leads us on to the next problem. This is a Mark 1 high pressure line, and I'm still running the Mark 2 steering rack. And this line doesn't fit the Mark 2 steering rack whatsoever. I've got a picture here of a Mark 2 steering rack. As you can see, the high pressure line starts here at the pump, goes round to the flexi, attaches to the subframe, and round into the steering rack here. Notice these two little bends here where the pipe goes into the rack, and comparing that to a Mark 1 steering rack, flexis here, goes round into solid pipe and into the rack. As you can see, the way it joins into the rack is completely different, so this just won't fit into this. Well, the solution for this was pretty simple. I took the flexible end from the Mark 1 power steering system and chopped it right after the bend on the solid steel pipe, and then took the steel pipe from the Mark II power steering rack, cut it in the right place, and joined these two pipes with a double female olive fitting to make a Mark II, Mark 1 power steering pipe. And this has fixed the problem pretty well. The old Mark II high pressure line used to be supported on the subframe up here, but now there's an intercooler line in the way, and the Mark 1 power steering line mounts completely different. So I've added a nice stainless steel bracket onto my steering rack, which will hold the high pressure steering line nicely. That's sitting there nicely now. Now, onto the low pressure pipe. The old one used to bend round here, up above the steering rack, and back out, and then to the steering cooler. But there's now an intercooler in my way, so the power steering cooler won't sit here anymore. And where the low pressure pipe did bend up around this rack and the pipe come out here, there's now the intercooler pipe in the way. So I've done almost the same with the low pressure side as I have the high pressure side. I've kept the important bend of the steel pipe, and I've got a local hydraulic company to make up a flexi line with a crimped fitting on the end, and it's just an olived fitting this end. So I've got the standard steel line joined straight to a flexi line, which I've then supported with this stainless steel bracket I've made, and then comes round to the power steering cooler. The old original power steering cooler looks like this. I'm not quite sure how this dissipated the heat, but now it's completely useless. Because I can't use the standard power steering cooler anymore, and this steering rack is going to go from lock to lock many times really quickly, I found it necessary to upgrade the power steering cooler. And I've gone for a 4-row aluminium power steering cooler, which is sitting the passenger side of the car. There is actually a hole in the bumper here, which will allow nice fresh cool air to go through this power steering cooler. To hold this, I've just made some brackets out of some bar steel. Nothing too strong, as if I have an accident, I want the brackets to bend rather than the cooler. Once I've got the bumper on and I know this is in the right place, I'll cut down these bolts and paint the brackets. And from the power steering cooler, we've got a line on the top here, which feeds into a gap between the radiator and the chassis leg, which then leads back into the engine bay and into the power steering reservoir. In the future, I can of course add a small fan to this if I find my power steering fluid is boiling over. The last thing to do is pop that power steering belt back on, tighten the new tensioner up until you've got a quarter of a turn on the belt and no more. Lock both lock nuts off and tighten the main power steering pivot bolt, and just recheck the tension on the belt. All that's left to do is chuck some hose clamps on the hoses that need them, fill it up with fluid and check it for leaks. But that is the power steering on a Mark II turbo all complete, hopefully. I'm pretty confident this system is going to work wonderfully, but if any of you guys have had previous experiences or doubts, let me know in the comments down below. If this helped you solve your issue of having power steering with a turbo MX5, let me know in the comments down below. As per usual, like and share this video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.